Imagine living in a world where July felt like January, where snow blanketed green fields, birds froze mid-flight, and desperate farmers gnawed on boiled leather to stay alive. In 1816, people across the northern hemisphere stared at the cold, colorless sky and wondered if the end of days had arrived. They called it the year without a summer. Frost bit through June, crops failed across continents, and the sun itself seemed to dim. The skies were heavy with ash and despair. Entire villages starved, children were abandoned, and eerie red sunsets painted the heavens like a warning from God. No one knew what had gone wrong with the world, but the truth was far stranger than anyone imagined. It wasn't a curse, a plague or divine punishment. It was the earth itself, wounded by one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in history. A blast so massive it changed the weather of the world, and that's where our story begins. The year was 1815. The place, a small Indonesian island called Sumbawa. Few in the Western world had ever heard of it. But that would soon change, because beneath its lush forests and calm villages, something monstrous was stirring. Mount Tambora had been quiet for centuries. Locals called it Gunung Api, simply meaning fire mountain. But by April 1815, the mountain began to growl. Tremors shook the ground, animals fled into the jungles, and strange columns of smoke coiled into the sky. Then, on the evening of April 10th, 1815, the earth screamed. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Mount Tambora erupted with a force so colossal that it could be heard over 200 miles away, as far as Sumatra. To put that in perspective, that's like hearing an explosion in New York, all the way from Miami. Witnesses described the sky as if 1,000 cannons were firing at once. Flaming boulders the size of houses rained down. Lightning crackled through black clouds of ash. The air turned to fire, and then just as suddenly darkness. Within hours, the entire top of the mountain had been blown apart. What was once 14,000 feet high had collapsed into a massive crater nearly 4 miles wide. Villages within 25 miles were instantly incinerated. Ships sailing hundreds of miles away were pelted with volcanic debris. The captain of the Benares, a British vessel, recorded a darkness so complete that for 2 days, not even the hand before one's face could be seen. And then came the tsunami. The eruption displaced entire sections of the ocean, creating waves up to 13 feet high that slammed into nearby islands. Coastal settlements were erased in seconds. The official death toll on Sumbawa and neighboring islands reached over 90,000. But many historians believe it was far higher, but those deaths were just the beginning, because the true killer wasn't the eruption itself, it was what came after. Tambora had ejected more than 100 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and dust into the atmosphere. That's enough material to fill 40 million Olympic swimming pools. But most importantly, it blasted millions of tons of sulfur dioxide straight into the stratosphere, high above the Earth. These sulfur particles mixed with water vapor to form an enormous veil of aerosols that circled the globe. This veil reflected sunlight back into space, dimming the world below. The skies turned a haunting copper red. The moon glowed blue, and slowly, silently, global temperatures began to fall. In the months that followed, farmers in Europe noticed their crops growing slower than usual. In New England, people saw strange sunsets that lingered long after dusk. But no one connected these eerie omens to a volcano on the other side of the world. How could they? In 1815, there was no internet, no telegraphs, no way to link distant catastrophes. So when 1816 arrived, and when the summer failed to come, the world was left in total confusion. The planet had entered what scientists now call a volcanic winter. The next year would bring starvation, riots, and even madness. And as the skies stayed dark, people began to believe the world itself was dying. Spring 1816 came late, eerily late. In Europe, people waited for the snow to melt, but it didn't. In the northeastern United States, farmers prepared to sow their seeds in May. But the ground was still frozen solid, and when June finally arrived, it snowed. Across New England, frost coated every field and rooftop. On June 6th, a blizzard struck upstate New York, dumping several inches of snow. In Quebec, sleighs were still being used in mid-June. Chickens froze in their coops. Birds fell from the sky. People called it the poverty year. But this was no ordinary cold spell. The sun itself seemed wrong. Witnesses described a dim orange sun that never warmed the earth. Days looked like twilight. Nights glowed faintly red. In England, poets wrote that the sun was blood. In villages from Switzerland to Vermont, panic spread. Was this divine punishment? Had the end times arrived? But the most terrifying part wasn't the snow. It was the hunger. Crops failed everywhere. Wheat, oats, and corn refused to grow in the chilled soil. Entire harvests were lost. The few surviving crops were stunted, bitter, and moldy. In Ireland, farmers watched helplessly as their potato fields blackened and died. In Germany, desperate peasants ate cats, dogs, and even grass. In Switzerland, people ground up acorns, sawdust, and straw to make bread. In one account from Geneva, starving families boiled nettles and weeds into soup, their only meal for days. And when the food ran out, people turned on each other. Riots erupted in cities across Europe. In France, mobs looted bakeries shouting, "Bread or blood!" In England, grain warehouses were raided by starving farmers. Austria saw food prices triple in a matter of months. One historian later called it the worst famine in Western Europe of the 19th century. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America wasn't spared either. In Vermont, temperatures dropped below freezing every single month of the year, even July. Cornfields withered under frost. Cattle starved, and families were forced to eat whatever they could find. People packed up and fled westward, hoping the Ohio Valley might be warmer. This mass migration became known as the Year of Moving West. The summer that never came turned prosperous towns into ghost villages. Imagine waking up in July to see snow falling outside your window, your farm destroyed, your children crying from hunger. You'd wonder if the world itself had broken. And that's exactly what millions of people felt: dread. Yet, oddly enough, in all this misery, strange things began to happen. Artists painted haunting, fiery sunset, inspired by the volcanic dust still hanging in the air. Poets and writers described a world dimmed and dying. One young woman, trapped indoors by the freezing weather on the shores of Lake Geneva, decided to write a ghost story. Her name? Mary Shelley. She called her story Frankenstein, the cold, eerie atmosphere of 1816, the storms, the unnatural sky, the sense that humanity had angered nature. All of it shaped her imagination. So, in a bizarre twist, the very disaster that starved millions also gave birth to one of the most famous horror stories ever written. Meanwhile, scientists, priests, and astrologers all struggled to explain the phenomenon. Some blamed sunspots, others comets, and some insisted it was God's punishment for mankind's sins. But no one suspected the truth, that a volcano on a small island thousands of miles away had plunged the planet into this icy chaos. And as the food ran out, a darker, more desperate side of humanity began to emerge. By late 1816, hunger had turned to desperation. Crops had failed twice in a row. Livestock were dead or slaughtered. Food markets stood empty. And in the towns and villages of Europe and North America, people began to do the unthinkable. In Switzerland, where snow still covered the mountains even in August, parents were found abandoning their children because they couldn't feed them. Some families sold their sons and daughters as laborers just to survive the winter. The clergy wrote of bodies of infants left at church doors like offerings to God. In Ireland and southern Germany, travelers spoke of roadside corpses, men and women who had collapsed mid-journey, clutching grass or bark in their mouths. But in some corners of the world, hunger crossed the final taboo: cannibalism. There are scattered reports from China's Yunnan province, also struck by the global crop failures, where starving peasants resorted to eating human flesh. In European folklore of the time, parents whispered dark bedtime warnings to their children. Behave, or you'll be eaten like in the famine. While these stories are difficult to verify, the fear they inspired was real. The human mind, after all, was unraveling under the weight of starvation. In Germany, entire towns suffered what physicians called hunger madness. Villagers reported hallucinations, night terrors, and violent outbreaks. In one Bavarian village, an old man was beaten to death because locals believed he had hidden bread in his house. Meanwhile, the social order, everything people relied on for stability, collapsed. In cities like Vienna and Paris, crime skyrocketed. Thieves raided bakeries and mills, while desperate crowds attacked grain convoys. In Switzerland, a government report recorded Bands of starving people roaming the countryside, eating raw vegetables from the ground like beasts. And then came the refugees. Tens of thousands of families fled their homelands in search of food and warmth. The roads of Europe filled with migrants, skeletal figures trudging through the cold mud, carrying what little they had left. Children wrapped in rags, mothers sobbing, fathers silent. It looked less like a migration and more like an exodus. Across the Atlantic, in America, something similar was happening, though for different reasons. The freezing weather had destroyed farms across New England, so thousands of families hitched their wagons and headed west toward the Ohio and Indiana territories. They called themselves the Frost Refugees. It was one of the earliest large-scale migrations in U.S. history, all triggered by a volcano half a world away. But famine doesn't just destroy the body, it destroys faith. Churches overflowed with terrified believers praying for deliverance. Others turned to superstition. In parts of Europe, rumors spread that witches or weather sorcerers had cursed the land. Entire mobs hunted and killed supposed witches, a chilling echo of medieval madness returning to the 19th century. One Swiss minister wrote, "The people are losing their minds. They see omens in the clouds, demons in the frost, and devils in the starving eyes of their neighbors." And he wasn't exaggerating. The year without a summer wasn't just a climate disaster. It was a psychological one. People stopped trusting their neighbors, their governments, even their own senses. When the sun itself seems to vanish, what else can you believe in? And yet, out of this despair came strange acts of unity. Some communities shared what little food they had left. Others built communal kitchens, feeding strangers without question. In Vermont, one town declared, "If we cannot live well, we shall at least live kindly." A flicker of humanity survived, but only barely. By early 1817, the worst of the famine began to ease. The skies lightened. The temperatures rose slightly. But the world that emerged was forever changed. Entire generations had been scarred. Millions had died, and the survivors were left wondering what had really caused the sun to vanish. By the time the skies began to clear in 1817, the world had changed, and not just because of hunger. The year without summer had set off a chain reaction that reached every corner of the globe. The volcanic winter of 1816 was like nature's global reset button. Empires fell, borders shifted, and humanity, desperate to adapt, started to innovate. Let's start with Europe, where the social fabric was already worn thin after decades of Napoleonic wars. Crops had failed, soldiers were returning home to ruined farms, and food riots became daily news. In Britain, mobs stormed grain markets and protested outside Parliament, accusing the government of hoarding supplies. In Switzerland and France, starving citizens demanded democracy, equality, and food. The same cry that had sparked the French Revolution just a few decades earlier. Some historians argue that these riots and revolts directly influenced Europe's wave of social uprisings in the 1820s and 1830s. But the chain reaction didn't stop in Europe. Across the Atlantic, the United States was experiencing its own crisis, but also opportunity. The freezing weather and failed harvests in New England forced thousands of families to migrate westward, into what were then the frontiers of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. This massive population shift reshaped the map of America, accelerating the country's westward expansion by decades. Entire new towns sprang up, towns that might never have existed if not for Tambora's ash cloud. Some of those Frost refugee settlers' descendants would later form the backbone of America's industrial heartland. And there's another curious twist. The cold, gloomy summer of 1816 inspired a device that would forever change the world. The bicycle. Yes, really. In Germany, a man named Karl Dreiss, frustrated that famine had killed most horses, people were eating them for food, decided to invent a new form of personal transport. In 1817, he unveiled the Lauf machine, or running machine, the first two-wheeled, human-powered vehicle in history. That primitive wooden contraption would evolve within decades into the modern bicycle, all thanks to the year without a summer. Meanwhile, in Asia, the effects were even more far-reaching. The cold and drought in China and India triggered massive crop failures. In Yunnan province, the famine killed hundreds of thousands and forced survivors to migrate southward into Southeast Asia. Historians now believe this migration helped establish Chinese communities in modern-day Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia, shaping the cultural demographics of the region for generations. In Bengal and other parts of India, the strange weather disrupted the monsoon cycle. Droughts alternated with floods, destroying rice paddies and sparking outbreaks of disease. And from that suffering came another historic consequence: the first recorded global cholera pandemic. The epidemic began in Bengal in 1817, just as the volcanic haze was thinning. The bacteria thrived in polluted water sources, spreading rapidly along trade routes to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Millions more died, indirectly, still victims of Tambora's shadow. The dominoes just kept falling. In the Caribbean, volcanic dust cooled the ocean surface, weakening tropical storms for several years, a temporary but eerie hurricane drought. In Canada, the unseasonal frosts delayed colonization efforts by British settlers. Even Africa's weather patterns shifted, with rainfall anomalies recorded as far as the Nile Delta. And while many people viewed 1816 as a year of doom, a few saw it as divine warning, a chance to reform humanity itself. Religious movements gained new energy. Revivalist preachers filled churches, predicting the Second Coming. Others saw the disaster as proof of climate's power to humble empires. In Britain, philosopher Mary Somerville began studying how volcanic dust affected sunlight, planting early seeds for what we now call climate science. And across Europe, the memory of 1816 lingered like a ghost, a reminder that nature, not kings or armies, truly ruled the world. It's chilling to think that one eruption on one remote island could set off revolts, inventions, migrations, and pandemics. But that's exactly what happened. Still, as we'll see next, Tambora's shadow wasn't done haunting humanity. It left behind something more subtle, a psychological scar, a collective paranoia about the fragility of civilization itself. When the skies finally began to clear in 1817, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but the scars went deeper than frostbitten fields and empty stomachs. For an entire generation, the year without summer became a symbol of fear, the idea that civilization could vanish overnight, swallowed not by war or plague but by nature itself. In Europe, artists and writers began to channel that dread into their work. The weather had created a mood, a kind of collective melancholy that soaked into the culture like fog. Let's start in Switzerland. That cold, wet summer of 1816 forced a group of English travelers to spend their days trapped inside a mansion on Lake Geneva. The endless storms outside seemed supernatural, thunder rolling over the Alps, lightning splitting the black sky. Among the guests were Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley. With nothing else to do, they decided to pass the time by telling ghost stories. One night, Byron proposed a contest. Each of us shall write a tale of terror. From that challenge came two of the most famous horror stories ever written: Byron's Vampire, which inspired modern vampire fiction, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Shelley later wrote that her idea came from a waking dream, where she saw a scientist kneeling beside a monstrous creation. The imagery, lightning, death, and the power of nature turned against humanity perfectly captured the mood of, so yes, one of the most iconic monsters in history was born from the gloom of Tambora's ash. But Frankenstein wasn't the only artistic child of that eerie year. Painters across Europe began depicting apocalyptic sunsets and bleak, fiery skies. The British artist J.M.W. Turner painted blood-red horizons that glowed unnaturally bright, the result of volcanic dust scattering light. People didn't realize it, but they were literally painting the afterglow of Mount Tambora. And in literature, the same sense of despair and fatalism spread. Poets like Lord Byron and Shelley wrote of dying suns and frozen worlds. Byron's 1816 poem Darkness described a planet without daylight. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. It wasn't just art. The year without summer rewired human imagination. Before 1816, apocalypse was mostly religious. Fire, brimstone, divine judgment. After 1816, apocalypse became scientific. It could be natural, accidental, unpredictable. It could come from the earth itself. This shift laid the foundation for the modern apocalyptic imagination, the same fear that would later drive nuclear paranoia, climate anxiety, and doomsday fiction. But the era's strange atmosphere also birthed something else: curiosity. As scientists investigated the cause of the dim skies, they began collecting climate data and studying atmospheric changes. This led to some of the first systematic observations of weather, the origins of modern meteorology. The very disaster that terrified millions also gave rise to a deeper understanding of our planet. Meanwhile, religion struggled to adapt. Churches were filled during 1816, people begging for forgiveness, convinced they were living through the end of days. But when the skies cleared and life returned, a new question haunted believers. If this wasn't God's wrath, what was it? Some saw the event as proof that the natural world followed its own brutal laws, independent of divine will. Others doubled down on faith, claiming only prayer had saved humanity. Either way, the balance between science and religion had shifted forever. Even decades later, survivors would speak of that strange year with shudders. Old farmers would tell their grandchildren, "There was a time when the sun didn't rise right." And though no one then understood the mechanics of climate, they all carried the same dread, that it could happen again. And the truth is, it can. Modern scientists warn that a similar eruption today could trigger another volcanic winter, disrupting crops, economies, and power grids across the globe. Mount Tambora may have quieted, but volcanoes like Yellowstone, Taal, and Krakatoa still simmer beneath the Earth's crust, sleeping giants capable of rewriting human history once more. The year without summer wasn't just a freak event. It was a glimpse, a reminder that our fragile world can change in a single breath of fire and ash. By 1818, the weather had begun to return to normal. The skies brightened, harvests slowly recovered, and people dared once again to believe in summer. But for those who had lived through 1816, the world never felt quite the same again. They had seen a sun that wouldn't shine. They had watched birds fall from the sky, rivers freeze in June, and fields turn to wastelands. They had buried neighbors, burned furniture for warmth, and prayed for mercy from a sky that gave none. And yet, humanity survived. The year without a summer became a story that old men told beside fires, a grim warning wrapped in disbelief. Because how could anyone truly understand it? The weather had betrayed them, the seasons had vanished, and it all began with a single explosion on a faraway island few could find on a map. For most people, the disaster eventually became myth. But for historians, and for us, it remains a haunting case study of how fragile civilization really is. Think about it. A single volcano in a corner of Indonesia managed to lower global temperatures by nearly 3 degrees. It triggered famines across 3 continents, collapsed economies, and inspired ghost stories that still shape pop culture today, all from one mountain. If a single eruption could do that in the 1800s, imagine what would happen today, in a world of 8 billion people, interconnected food systems, and fragile supply chains. Scientists have run the numbers. A super eruption like Tambora could knock out global harvests for years, grounding plains, dimming the sun, and plunging billions into crisis. It wouldn't just be the year without a summer, it would be the decade without normal life. And yet, there's another lesson buried in the ash, one about resilience, because out of that cold, starved, desperate year came innovation, art, migration, and science. People adapted. They moved west. They invented bicycles. They studied the sky. They created monsters and poems that still haunt us. It's proof that even in humanity's bleakest winters, imagination burns bright. But it also reminds us that the planet doesn't need our permission to change the rules. Tambora didn't care about kings or empires. It didn't care about science or superstition. It just exploded. And for one long, terrible year, nature reminded humanity who's really in charge. So, the next time you see a brilliant red sunset or feel the air grow strangely cold in midsummer, remember, we've been here before, and we'll probably be here again. Because history isn't just about what we've survived. It's about what we've yet to face. And that, my friends, was The Year Without a Summer, How a Volcano Turned 1816 into Global Famine Hell. A time when the world went dark. Crops died and out of the ash rose poetry, panic, and Frankenstein's monster. It's one of those stories that sounds too crazy to be real, but that's what we do here on Nutty Time Tales. Uncover the bizarre, the horrifying, and the beautifully absurd corners of history that textbooks like to skip. If you enjoyed this journey through the coldest summer in history, give this video a thumbs up to keep the fire going. Hit subscribe for more tales of weird history, dark legends, and forgotten madness from our planet's past. And before you go, tell me in the comments, if the sun disappeared for a year, what's the first thing you'd do? Until next time, stay curious, stay nutty, and remember, history isn't dead. It's just hiding in the shadows.